Wendell Berry, however, reminds us of the tragic version of individualism, whereby people proclaim it is their presumptive right as individuals to do as they please, as if there were no God, no legitimate government, no community, no neighbor, no posterity. Individualism, Berry insists, is perversely understood as the right to do whatever one pleases with one's property absolutely. Berry's conclusion is quite sobering. When property rights become absolute, they're used to justify the appropriation and abuse of that which can only belong to the public or the entire community of living creatures, namely the atmosphere, water cycle, wilderness, ecosystems, and the very possibility of life. The wealthy who live irresponsibly still justify their malice towards those who depend on entitlement programs by pointing to character deficiencies. Supporting the poor, they argue, diminishes the ability of the poor to become self-reliant. Self-reliance, not reliance upon government programs, that's what made America great. But the term self-reliance is miserably misunderstood. The essay, Self-Reliance, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 1841, was actually about relying on your own opinions rather than seeking the opinions of the world around you. Self-reliance never aimed to slander the poor. The focus of self-reliance was to fight against conformity. Emerson argues that conformity makes us unhappy because there exists a deep need to, as he says, trust thyself. Right? That's his mantra throughout the whole essay. Trust thyself, because the world will generally disapprove, and if we cave into public opinion, our self-worth will just shrivel up and die. Self-worth is understood as believing your own thoughts in a world in which it's getting progressively harder to do that. What we need to understand is that self-reliance is not an economic term that delineates virtue for the wealthy and contempt for the poor. And yet that is precisely how self-reliance is used and understood these days. It comes across as a wedge that separates the purportedly independently wealthy from the despicably poor who are so dependent. The poor lack the character we hear over and over again to become self-reliant. Such nonsense. Now, recently, David Brooks, columnist for the New York Times, who's syndicated widely, and he does pop up on occasion in the Salt Lake Tribune. This was, I'm guessing, 3 to 4 weeks ago. David Brooks really stirred up an enormous amount of controversy when he used the parable of the prodigal son to teach a modern-day lesson on how to deal with the class divide. Brooks makes an analogy between the prodigal son who squandered his inheritance, right? He makes an analogy between the prodigal son who just, blew it all, good time Charlie, and the poor in present-day America. It's as though to say the rich and poor started out equally, right? And the divide in society occurred when, according to Brooks, people dropped out of school, committed crimes, and abandoned their children. Brooks's term, he uses a phrase called kids being raised without fathers, as we know, is actually code for African American families, the poor, those who apparently squandered their treasures while seeking a self-indulgent life. And when the money is gone, they want government to take care of them. The poor need to be more self-reliant. We've got to teach them. So what ultimately happens in Brooks's attempt at this modern-day version of the prodigal son, he actually perpetuates the stereotype that continues to divide our country. He writes, "Many of us in the middle and upper classes are like the older brother. And those who drop out of school, commit crimes, and abandon their children are like the younger brother." In other words, those who have not succeeded have only themselves to blame for failing to play by the rules, as did the older brother, and failing at any kind of self-control. Now, Brooks does try to sound progressive. He does this by stating that our society should mirror the father in the parable, who demonstrates that forgiveness is the best pathway to get the younger brother, or in this case, the poor, to get the younger brother, again using Brooks's term, to get him to reform and rebound. Brooks suggests that if the father were stern with his younger son, the younger son would, and I quote, "never reform his life and become a productive member of the community." What is overlooked, aside from totally abusing this concept of self-reliance, is the fact that literally tens of millions of Americans are working hard but cannot advance because of low wages. What is needed is economic justice, and the older brothers in our nation, the upper middle class and wealthy, refuse to relinquish any part of their good life to allow a more equitable society to form. The irony for me is that the parable of the prodigal son does not need to be interpreted in a modern context by David Brooks or anyone. That parable is as timely today as it was 2,000 years ago. The parable is told by Jesus to whom? To the Pharisees. The Pharisees who are extremely judgmental of Jesus because Jesus was associating with, sinners. The Pharisees think very highly of themselves and are every bit as self-righteous as Wall Street's Gordon Gekko, or even, let's say, the Koch brothers. After all, look at the similarities. They are in power. They're dripping with success. They define the good life that they lead. The folks Jesus associated with were the scum of the earth. And the point of telling the Pharisees the parable was that Jesus wanted to point out that there were two different value systems at play. The Pharisees play by their own rules, and isn't that funny? They always wind up on top. Yet, another set of values exist, and those values manifest a concern for the poor, for the marginalized, those who have so little. And so the value systems really come down to, we're going to live a life of selfishness or selflessness. We're going to pursue the good life or the life that is good. The contemporary theologian Timothy Keller regards the parable of the prodigal son as two brothers representing two basic ways people try to make life work. The older brother is committed to a more socially respectable way of being in the world. It comes right down to it, the way of moral conformity. He wants to earn the approval of his community and feels he ought to be justly rewarded for playing by the rules for so much of his life. So I just wonder, throwing all these ideas out on one Sunday morning, is there Is there any kind of conclusion that we might draw from all of this, a lesson to be gained? Well, I hope so, and possibly there is. And that is that we may come to realize deep down, at the very core of our being, that our life tasks are many and the choices we face infinite. Each one of us tries to make our lives work somehow. And we feel pressure to conform and also are moved by a spirit that wants us to be freer. I want us to think about how self-reliant are we really? Do we, in fact, trust our own instincts, beliefs, and opinions? Or do we defer to more established points of view? Which values will ultimately shape our lives? How much do we need to possess to enter the good life, if we can ever figure out what the good life actually means? And how do we lead a life that is good and figure out what is demanded of us? How much am I willing to risk in order to love people the way Jesus did, or even Pope Francis? How much does anxiety fuel my actions? And do I pass that anxiety on to my children? In other words, would a speech on the lilies of the field at my child's commencement make me a little angry? How judgmental am I really, to be honest? How judgmental am I of those who have far less? Do I honestly believe that once upon a time we all started out as equals, as though we were two brothers raised by the same parents, same conditions, same inheritance awaiting us? Do I need to rethink these terms we hear every day and perhaps have become so twisted? Do I need to rethink words like individualism and self-reliance? And come to understand that these words are really tools that perpetuate oppression. This is what's the use they're used to keep people down. Do we need to rethink what those words really mean? It's all about building a life where mistakes are inevitable and forgiveness elusive. It's all about one's lot in life. And if chance has afforded me some privilege, then how much am I willing to risk my good life to advocate for a more equal playing field for all? These are the choices we face. They are political, they are ethical, and most of all, they are extremely personal. So be it.